If you like this story, please hit the subscribe button so you don't miss the next exciting stories. And now let's enjoy the story.
The wind roared like a beast in agony, its icy breath rattling the wooden cabin walls. Snowflakes slammed against the windows, thick and relentless, turning the night into an endless void of white. Inside, Daniel Cole sat near the crackling fireplace, staring into the flames with empty eyes. The solitude of his cabin had become his only companion since his wife Hannah had passed away 5 years ago. His world had once been filled with purpose, as a combat medic in the military, as a husband, as a man who had saved lives. But war had taken its toll. Loss had hollowed him out. Now he was just a man existing, not living. Then, through the howl of the storm, he heard it. A scratch. Daniel sat up, his body tensing. Then again, a faint, desperate scratching against the front door. He frowned. No one came out this far. He had deliberately built his home away from civilization to avoid exactly that. Another scratch, followed by a whimper. So soft, so fragile, it barely reached him through the wind. Daniel grabbed the rifle from the wall and approached the door with slow, calculated steps. His instincts, sharpened from years on the battlefield, told him this wasn't right. He pressed his ear to the wood. The whimper came again. Not human. A dog. For a moment he hesitated. A dog? In this storm? Out here, miles away from any town? Something was very wrong. His pulse quickened as he unlatched the door, bracing himself for the blast of frigid air. The wind howled as soon as the barrier was removed, stealing his breath and sending snow swirling into the cabin. But he barely noticed, because there, standing in the middle of the raging storm, was her. A German shepherd, her fur matted with ice and filth, stood trembling, barely able to hold herself upright. Her amber eyes locked onto his, but there was no aggression, only pleading. But what shattered Daniel completely was what lay beneath her. 2 tiny puppies, no more than a few weeks old, huddled against her frozen belly, their frail bodies shivering uncontrollably in the snow. The mother stood as still as a statue, her ribs jutting out from beneath her thin fur, her legs braced against the wind, shielding her pups from the storm with the last of her strength. She wasn't moving. She couldn't move. Yet, even as her body failed her, she refused to let her puppies be exposed to the cold. She would rather die than let them suffer. Daniel's chest tightened painfully. This wasn't just a lost dog. This was a mother who had been driven to the edge of survival, and even now, as she stood on the brink of death, her only concern was her babies. And someone had done this to her. Daniel knelt in front of the dog, his voice barely above a whisper. Jesus Christ, what the hell happened to you? The dog didn't move, didn't flinch. She only continued to stare at him, her breath coming out in weak, trembling puffs. Daniel's hand hovered over her, but before he could touch her, she flinched violently, her entire body cowering as if expecting a blow. His breath caught in his throat. She was afraid of him, not just cautious, terrified. Daniel clenched his fists, rage curling in his gut. Someone had beaten this dog. Someone had broken her. The scars on her body weren't just from the cold. They were from cruelty, from suffering. His jaw tightened as he took a slow, steady breath. He knew what had to be done. "Come on, girl," he murmured, keeping his voice low, gentle, even though his hands were trembling with rage. "Let's get you out of this storm." She didn't move. She wanted to trust him. He could see it in her eyes. But she had trusted a human before, and it had nearly killed her. A fresh gust of wind howled through the trees, whipping snow against her fragile body. The smaller of the 2 pups whimpered, trying to bury deeper into her fur. The mother closed her eyes for a moment, her body swaying, her exhaustion finally overtaking her. She was going to collapse. Daniel acted before thinking. He shrugged off his heavy coat, dropped to his knees, and wrapped it around her and the pups, shielding them from the relentless wind. She stiffened, eyes flying open, but she was too weak to fight. "Shh," he murmured, slowly slipping his arms under her frail frame. "I got you." The moment he lifted her, a pitiful sound tore from her throat, a mix between a whimper and a sob. Daniel swore under his breath as he felt just how light she was. Too light. She hadn't eaten in days, maybe weeks. His hands shook as he gently gathered the puppies in his coat, making sure they were secure. They were so small, so weak, their tiny bodies barely putting up a fight. With one final glance at the raging blizzard, Daniel pulled them into the warmth of the cabin and kicked the door shut. The storm had nearly taken them. but someone else had nearly taken them first. And whoever had done this, Daniel would make sure they never did it again. Chapter 2: A Fragile Trust. The cabin was warm, filled with the soft crackle of the fireplace, but the chill of the storm still clung to Daniel's skin. His heavy coat, now wrapped tightly around the half-frozen German Shepherd and her pups, was damp from melting snow, but he barely noticed. All he could see was the fragile, emaciated body of the mother dog, curled protectively around her two pups, as if she still believed they might be taken from her at any moment. Daniel moved carefully, setting them down by the fire, making sure not to startle her. She flinched anyway. Every small movement, the shift of his weight, the creak of the wooden floor beneath his boots, the distant hiss of wind against the cabin walls, made her body tense like a wound spring. She didn't trust him. And Daniel couldn't blame her. Who had done this to her? Who had starved her to the brink of death? Who had beaten her so brutally that even now, even in warmth and safety, she still feared the worst? The truth sat heavy in his chest, burning like a slow fire. He had seen eyes like hers before, on wounded soldiers, on people who had barely survived the worst of humanity. This dog had been failed by someone before, and now she thought he was just another threat. Daniel moved to the kitchen, his every step slow, deliberate, as if walking too fast might send her into a full-blown panic. He grabbed a clean towel, then filled a bowl with warm, not hot water. She needed food, but he knew better than to shove a full meal in front of a starving animal. It could kill her faster than the hunger itself. He crouched near her, setting the water down first, then the towel beside it. Her eyes flicked to the bowl, then back to him. She didn't move. Her ribs rose and fell in sharp, shallow breaths, as if she was trying to decide if this was another trick, another test of obedience that might end in pain. Daniel didn't touch her, didn't force her. He just waited. The pups, barely able to move on their own, squirmed closer to her belly, their tiny cries weak, exhausted. It was only then, when their frail bodies pressed into hers, when their soft whimpers pierced the silence of the cabin, that the mother dog moved. Not for herself, for them. With painful slowness, she lifted her head, her ears still pinned back in fear, and sniffed the water. Daniel didn't breathe. For a moment, he thought she might reject it, too afraid to lower her guard. Then, at last, she leaned forward and began to drink. The sound, the slow laps of water, the shuddering breaths between each sip, broke something inside Daniel's chest. This wasn't just thirst. This was desperation. This was a dog who had been denied even the most basic kindness, who had learned to expect that even water might be a trap. Daniel swallowed hard, forcing back the tight knot of anger in his throat. What kind of world let this happen? What kind of person looked at a dog like this and decided she wasn't worth saving? She drank until the bowl was empty, then slowly lowered her head again, curling around her pups once more. She still didn't look at him. But she had accepted the water. It was a start. Daniel stayed awake long after the fire had burned low, watching the dog and her puppies sleep. The pups, still too weak to do much else, nestled into the curve of their mother's body, their tiny bellies rising and falling. The mother dog, even in her exhaustion, never fully slept. Every now and then, her ears would flick at the creak of the wooden beams in the cabin. Her eyes would flutter open at the distant wail of the wind. Even here, in safety, she couldn't let go of the fear. Daniel knew that kind of sleep. It was the kind that haunted men who had survived war, the kind that kept a rifle within arm's reach, the kind that made the past impossible to escape. He ran a hand over his face, exhaling slowly. He couldn't fix her tonight, but he could make sure she never had to live in fear again. And that, for now, was enough. When Daniel woke, the storm had passed. The first rays of morning sunlight slipped through the cracks in the cabin's heavy curtains, casting long golden streaks across the wooden floor. The mother dog was still there, curled in the same spot, but something was different. She was watching him. Not with trust, not yet, but with less fear. Daniel moved slowly, stretching out his sore limbs before heading to the kitchen. He grabbed a can of chicken broth, something light, easy on the stomach, and poured a small portion into a bowl. When he placed it in front of her, she stared at it, then back at him. Her muscles tensed, as if bracing for something. And that's when it hit Daniel. She thought she had to earn it. A fresh wave of rage rolled through him, but he kept his voice calm. "You don't have to do anything," he murmured. "It's yours." Her ears flicked back. She hesitated, and then, ever so slowly, she leaned forward and took her first bite. Daniel watched as she ate, his jaw tight. How long had she been forced to beg for food? How many times had a hand been raised against her instead of offering kindness? He let her finish before reaching for the towel. She flinched when he moved, but didn't run. Daniel spoke softly, every word meant to soothe rather than command. "I'm just going to clean you up a bit, all right?" She let out a slow breath. Not quite trust, but not rejection either. When Daniel gently pressed the warm towel against her fur, he felt her whole body shudder. The dirt and ice melted away, revealing something far worse underneath. Scars, dozens of them. Some small and faded, others long and jagged, running down her ribs across her shoulders. Daniel's hands shook as he worked, each mark telling a story he didn't want to hear. Someone had hurt her, repeatedly, and yet she had survived. Daniel swallowed past the burning in his throat. No more, he thought. Whatever she had been through before, it ended here. She wasn't just another forgotten dog. She wasn't just another victim. She was hope. And Daniel would make damn sure that no one ever hurt her again. The morning light stretched across the wooden floor of the cabin, casting a warm glow that contrasted with the frost still clinging to the windows. Daniel sat at the edge of his worn-out chair, his elbows resting on his knees as he watched Hope, the name now fitting the resilient German shepherd, curled protectively around her two tiny pups. She had eaten, she had drunk water, but her body still carried the exhaustion of someone who had endured too much for too long. Daniel had spent the early morning cleaning her wounds, running his fingers gently over the scars etched into her frail body. Each mark told a story he didn't want to imagine. Some were thin, almost faded with time, but others were deep, jagged, like the result of a cruel hand, or worse, a deliberate punishment. The worst of them stretched across her ribs, pink lines of old injuries that had once split her skin open. They were not the marks of an accident. They were man-made. He had seen wounds like these before. On soldiers. On people who had lived through the worst of humanity. And now, here they were on a dog who had never asked for anything but the chance to survive. The thought made his stomach turn. Hope had flinched with every touch, her body stiff as stone, her eyes darting up at him as if waiting for something. Waiting for pain. Waiting for anger, waiting for the moment when his kindness would run out. But it never did. Daniel had spoken to her softly, moved slowly, let her feel his presence without forcing himself on her. He let her know he wasn't here to hurt her, that whatever she had known before, it was over now. She had endured abandonment, starvation, cruelty, and yet she was still here. She had crawled through the snowstorm, carried her helpless pups through the freezing winds, and when she could have given up, she had kept going. Daniel exhaled, rubbing a hand down his face. Hope had not come from the wild. She was not some lost stray. Someone had bred her, owned her, used her, and when she had outlived her usefulness, they had tossed her aside like garbage. The idea made his jaw clench. The question now was, who had done this? Daniel knew he had to find answers, not just for Hope, but for himself. His gut told him that whoever had hurt her was not done with her yet. If she had been tossed away, it wasn't just a simple case of neglect. It was a deliberate choice. And people like that don't just stop looking for what they think belongs to them. With one last glance at Hope, who was now dozing beside the fire, her pups curled tightly into her, Daniel grabbed his phone and stepped onto the porch. The cold air hit him instantly, the remains of last night's storm still thick on the ground. He took a deep breath and dialed a number he hadn't called in a long time. The line rang twice before a gruff voice answered. "Cole? Hell, man, I thought you were dead." Daniel let out a dry chuckle. "Not yet, Carter." Jake Carter had served alongside him in the military, but after retirement he had taken a different path, working in law enforcement and animal control, specializing in cases of abuse and illegal breeding. If anyone could help him figure out where Hope had come from, it was Jake. "What's this about?" Jake asked, his voice turning serious, already sensing that Daniel wouldn't be calling him after all these years without a reason. Daniel glanced back through the cabin window, watching Hope shift in her sleep. "I found a dog," he said carefully. "German shepherd. Scarred up. Real bad. She showed up outside my place in the middle of a blizzard with 2 newborn pups. There was a pause on the other end of the line. And? Jake pressed. Daniel exhaled. And I don't think she got those scars from running through the woods. Jake let out a long breath. Shit. Yeah, Daniel muttered, running a hand through his hair. She's got a number tattooed inside her ear. Looks like an old breeder mark. Jake went silent for a second before muttering a curse. You better give me that number, Cole. Daniel rattled it off, hearing Jake's keyboard clatter in the background. There was a long silence, then the sound of a chair scraping against the floor. Daniel, I don't think you understand what you just stepped into. Daniel's grip on the phone tightened. Try me. Jake let out a slow breath. That dog, if she's got the marking you just gave me, she wasn't just from any breeder. She came from Blackridge Kennels. The name sent a cold chill down Daniel's spine. Even someone like him, who had spent years away from the world, isolating himself in this cabin, knew that name. Blackridge Kennels wasn't just some backyard operation. It was one of the most notorious illegal breeding farms in the country. They didn't just breed dogs. They forced them to fight, overbred females until their bodies gave out, and dumped or killed the ones they didn't need anymore. And hope had come from them. Daniel's stomach twisted as he turned back toward the cabin. He looked at Hope differently now, not just as a survivor, but as a living piece of evidence against people who should have been in prison a long time ago. He could feel his own pulse in his ears, a slow, building rage bubbling beneath his skin. What the hell do I do, Jake? Jake hesitated before saying something that made Daniel's blood run cold. If they dumped her, it means they thought she was useless. Daniel's jaw tightened. But if they find out she's alive, they might want her back. Daniel looked through the window again. Hope was still curled around her puppies, her body relaxed for the first time since she had arrived. She had fought so hard just to get here, to protect them, to survive. No one was taking her back. No one was ever hurting her again. Over the phone, Jake sighed heavily. You up for a fight, Cole? Daniel's eyes hardened as he watched Hope sleep, the scars on her body a reminder of the world she had barely escaped. If they come here looking for her, they'll regret it, he said simply. Jake let out a low chuckle. Knew you were going to say that. Daniel exhaled, the weight of what was ahead settling deep in his bones. He had spent so long running from the world, from people, from responsibility. But Hope had crawled to his doorstep in the middle of a storm, carrying the last of her strength and 2 tiny lives depending on her. She had fought for her freedom. Now Daniel would fight for her. And he didn't care who he had to go through to keep her safe. The air inside the cabin was warm, but a chill ran through Daniel's veins as he processed what Jake had told him. Blackridge Kennels. The name itself carried a weight of cruelty and suffering. A place where dogs were treated like machines, their worth measured only by how much they could endure before breaking. Hope had come from that hell. Daniel stood at the window, his arms crossed over his chest, staring out at the snow-covered trees. He could still see the faint imprints of Hope's paw prints leading up to the door, the only proof of her desperate journey through the blizzard. How far had she run? How long had she fought just to get here? Behind him, the soft sounds of breathing filled the room. Hope was asleep by the fire, her body curled tightly around her puppies, as if afraid they might disappear if she loosened her grip. Even in sleep, she twitched, her muscles coiled with tension, haunted by whatever nightmares lurked in her past. Daniel clenched his fists. She had suffered enough. He wouldn't let them take her back. The next morning, Daniel decided he needed to check the area. If Hope had come from Blackridge, it meant she had either escaped or been discarded. Either way, someone might be looking for her. After filling Hope's bowl with fresh broth and making sure the fire was steady, he pulled on his boots and coat, stepping outside. The storm had passed, leaving behind a thick layer of snow, untouched except for the small trails of footprints around his cabin. But as he scanned the tree line, something made his stomach tighten. There, just beyond the clearing where the shadows of the forest began, was a set of boot prints. Not his, not from the storm. Fresh. Daniel's pulse quickened. Someone had been here, watching. He knelt, running his fingers over the impressions in the snow. They weren't old, less than a few hours at most, The tracks led deeper into the woods, but he already knew what it meant. They were looking for her. Daniel stood, his jaw tightening. He turned back toward the cabin, scanning the windows. Hope was still inside, unaware of the danger that lurked just beyond the trees. She had come here for safety, but safety was no longer guaranteed. Daniel wasn't a man who panicked easily. He had spent years in combat, had seen the worst of human cruelty, and had learned how to survive in situations most people wouldn't walk away from. But this was different. Hope wasn't a soldier. She wasn't trained for war. She had already been through enough hell. Daniel had no intention of letting her walk into another. Stepping inside, he placed his rifle near the doorway, within easy reach. Hope lifted her head slightly, watching him with those same amber eyes that had haunted him since the moment he found her. He crouched beside her, careful not to move too fast. "You're safe here," he murmured, more to himself than to her, because now he wasn't entirely sure that was true. Hope didn't move, but her gaze never left his. She understood. Something had changed. By evening, Daniel had almost convinced himself that whoever had been watching wouldn't return. He had checked the perimeter twice, covered the tracks near his cabin, and made sure Hope and her pups were warm and fed. Then, just as he was about to lock up for the night, a sound froze him in place. The distant crunch of snow. Not the wind. Not an animal. Footsteps. Daniel's fingers instinctively wrapped around the handle of his rifle as he moved to the window, peering out into the darkness. At first, he saw nothing but shadows between the trees. Then, a flicker of movement. A figure, standing just at the edge of the tree line, too far to see clearly, but close enough that Daniel knew this wasn't an accident. Someone had found him, and they weren't trying to hide it. Daniel didn't move. He didn't speak. He simply waited, watching as the figure remained still, watching him in return. The cold air pressed in from outside, but inside, Daniel's grip on his rifle was warm, steady. Minutes passed. Then, without a word, the figure turned and disappeared back into the woods. Daniel let out a slow breath. He could have chased them. He could have fired a warning shot. But he knew this wasn't over. This wasn't a confrontation. It was a message. Someone had come looking. They had found Hope's trail, and they weren't going to stop until they took back what they thought belonged to them. The next morning, Daniel called Jake again. "They were here," Daniel said before Jake could even get a word in. Silence. Then a low curse. "Describe them." "Didn't get a close look," Daniel admitted, "but they wanted me to know they were watching." Jake sighed heavily. "If they've tracked her that far, you need to be ready, Cole. These people don't just take their dogs back, they make sure no one gets in their way." Daniel clenched his jaw. "Let them try." Jake hesitated. "Daniel, listen to me. Find me a name." "Come off, who runs Blackridge now?" Jake exhaled slowly. "You're not gonna like the answer." Daniel waited, his pulse slow, steady. Then Jake said a name that made the room feel 10 degrees colder. "Mason Ward." Daniel's grip on the phone tightened until his knuckles turned white. He knew that name. He had heard it before, back when he was still in uniform, back when men like Mason weren't just criminals, but monsters hiding behind legal loopholes. Mason Ward wasn't just a breeder. He was a butcher. He ran his operation under the guise of protection training, breeding hundreds of dogs for underground fighting rings, starving them, forcing them to fight or die, and when they weren't useful anymore, they disappeared. Daniel felt a slow, simmering rage settle in his bones. Hope had come from that man's hands. And now, Mason Ward wanted her back. Jake's voice cut through the silence. "Daniel, tell me you're not about to do something stupid." Daniel's eyes drifted toward Hope, still curled around her pups, her body too thin, her face still wary, still waiting for the moment this safety turned into another nightmare. He had spent the last 5 years isolating himself, pretending the world wasn't worth fighting for anymore. But Hope had changed that. She had crawled through a storm, barely alive, to save her children. And now Daniel was going to make damn sure she never had to run again. His voice was steady when he answered. "They want her?" he said. "They'll have to go through me first." The sun had barely begun to rise over the snow-covered landscape, but Daniel had already been awake for hours. He sat at the worn wooden table, a steaming cup of black coffee in front of him, untouched. His rifle rested against the wall within arm's reach. His mind was clear, his instincts sharp. War was coming. Hope lay beside the fireplace, her pups nestled against her, sleeping soundly. They had no idea what kind of danger was closing in around them. Daniel had faced threats before. He had spent years in war zones, learning how to read danger before it arrived, knowing how to prepare for the worst. But this wasn't a battlefield. This wasn't a fight against armed soldiers who knew the cost of war. This was something worse. Mason Ward wasn't just a criminal. He was a man who operated outside the law, a man who believed he was untouchable. And men like that didn't send warnings for nothing. They sent them because they already thought they'd won. Daniel wasn't about to let that happen. The first step was making sure no one could take Hope without a fight. Daniel moved through the cabin, checking the doors, the windows, the locks. He reinforced the front and back entrances, securing them with extra bars of wood. He placed motion-triggered lights around the perimeter, making sure he'd know the second someone got too close. Next, he made sure Hope had an escape plan. If things went south, he wouldn't let her be caught in the crossfire. He packed a small bag with food, supplies, and blankets, something she could use if she had to run. But deep down, he knew. Hope had spent her life running. She deserved better than that. And this time, he wasn't going to let her fight alone. By late afternoon, Hope started acting differently. She sat by the window, her ears perked, her body rigid. Her tail, normally tucked when she was nervous, was now low and stiff, a sign of deep unease. Daniel crouched beside her. "What is it, girl?" She didn't respond at first, but then she let out a low, guttural growl, one that sent chills down his spine. Daniel's muscles tensed as he followed her gaze. Outside, just beyond the tree line, the footprints from the night before had been disturbed. The snow had been shifted, as if someone had been there again, standing in the same spot. Watching, waiting. His grip on his rifle tightened. They were getting bolder. Hope let out another growl, her body trembling, not in fear, but in recognition. She knew. She knew who was coming. Daniel reached out slowly, resting a hand on her scarred back. "Not this time," he murmured. "I promise you." Hope leaned into him just slightly. It was the first time she had ever done that, and it was the only confirmation he needed. Night fell, and Daniel sat in his chair by the fire, rifle across his lap, waiting. The air was thick with tension, the kind that pressed against his ribs and coiled at the base of his spine. Then, at exactly 1:37 a.m., it happened. A sharp thud against the porch. Daniel was on his feet in an instant, rifle raised, heart pounding. Hope had already bolted upright, her body stiff, her ears flattened back. Another thud. Something had been dropped at his door. Daniel moved slowly, his pulse steady, his footsteps soundless as he approached the front door. He unlocked it carefully, swinging it open just enough to see what had been left behind. A dead rabbit. Its neck had been snapped clean, its body still warm, blood smearing the snow. Daniel's jaw clenched. This wasn't just a threat, this was a warning. A reminder. They were here, they were watching, and they weren't afraid to take lives. He shut the door, locking it tight before turning back toward Hope. She had backed away, her body low, her tail curled in, her entire frame shaking. She had seen this before. Daniel crouched beside her, his voice firm, steady. "They're not taking you back." Hope looked at him, those haunted amber eyes full of fear, full of something even deeper, understanding. Because now she knew too. The fight was coming. At dawn, Daniel made another call to Jake. The second his friend Pig picked up, Daniel got straight to the point. They were here. A sharp curse on the other end. "What did they do?" "Left a dead rabbit on my porch." Silence. Then Jake's voice dropped lower. "That's Mason's style. It's a test." "A test?" Jake exhaled. "They're seeing if you're scared, if you'll fold, if you'll give her up easy." Daniel gritted his teeth. "They should know better." "Cole, no," Daniel snapped. "Listen to me, Jake. This isn't about a dog to them. This is about ownership, control, power. They think they can do whatever they want. They think they can just take her." Jake was quiet. Then finally he sighed. "I know that look on your face. You're not backing down." "Damn right, I'm not." Another pause. Then Jake spoke again, his voice quieter, but just as deadly. "Then you better be ready to kill someone." Daniel knew Jake was right. This wasn't a negotiation. This wasn't about convincing them to leave Hope alone. This was about survival. And Daniel had spent years surviving. He dismantled his rifle, cleaned every piece, reassembled it with careful precision. He loaded extra rounds, checked the locking mechanisms on the doors, set up additional traps outside the cabin. And then he did something he hadn't done in years. He prayed. Not for himself, but for Hope and her pups. Because if Mason Ward and his men were coming, Daniel wasn't sure if he'd make it out alive. But he was damn sure of one thing. Hope was going to live, even if it meant Daniel had to die for it. The forest was too quiet, the kind of quiet that came before a storm, before a kill. The air was thick with frost, but Daniel felt the heat of adrenaline spreading through his veins as he crouched by the window, his rifle in hand, eyes scanning the tree line. They were coming. He didn't know when, he didn't know how many, but the dead rabbit on his porch had made their message clear. This was a hunt. And Hope was the prize. Behind him, Hope was pressed against the wall, her body coiled, her ears flicking at every slight sound. She knew too. Her pups whimpered, sensing the tension in the room, their tiny bodies huddling deeper into the blankets Daniel had laid out for them. Daniel had prepared for this, reinforced the doors, locked down every entry point, placed barriers near the windows. But he also knew a wooden cabin in the middle of nowhere wouldn't hold off men like Mason Ward and his people for long. The plan was simple. Hold them off. Make them regret coming here. And if it came down to it, make sure Hope and the pups got away. A movement in the distance caught his eye. Then another. Daniel's breath slowed. They were here. A sharp crack split the silence. A gunshot hitting the side of the cabin with a heavy thud. Daniel didn't flinch. He had expected them to fire first. It wasn't meant to kill him. It was intimidation. A signal. A second shot rang out, this time hitting one of the porch lights, shattering it in a burst of glass. Daniel's grip on his rifle tightened. They were trying to make him afraid. They had no idea who they were dealing with. Daniel let them have their moment, let them think they were in control. Then, with slow precision, he took his position by the window, lined up the shot, and squeezed the trigger. The first man went down before he even knew what hit him. A strangled cry echoed through the trees as the figure dropped, clutching his leg where Daniel's bullet had torn through muscle and bone. Chaos erupted. Voices shouted in the darkness, boots crunched against snow, and suddenly, the game had changed. They weren't hunting anymore. They were being hunted. The first one tried the front door, testing the handle, but Daniel had barricaded it tight. He heard them cursing, heard them calling out orders. They thought they had numbers on their side. Daniel smirked. They had no idea how dangerous a cornered man with nothing to lose could be. A crash from the back sent Daniel spinning. They were trying to force their way in. Hope let out a low growl, her body pressing against the pups, shielding them. Daniel's blood boiled. They weren't getting in, not while he was still breathing. Daniel moved fast, his body operating on pure combat instinct. He grabbed the shotgun from the table, pumped around into the chamber, and fired toward the back door, just as the wood splintered inward. A scream, a thump, another one down. But they weren't stopping. A figure appeared at the window, silhouetted against the darkness. Before they could aim, Daniel fired again. Glass exploded outward, and the man tumbled back into the snow, groaning. "You're dead, Cole," a voice roared from outside. Daniel almost laughed. They were the ones breaking into his home, and they thought they had the upper hand? He called back, voice cold, controlled. "Come and get me, then." The cabin shook as someone threw their weight against the door, wood creaking under the pressure. Another shot blasted through a window, sending shards of glass scattering across the floor. Hope flinched, but she didn't run. She stood her ground. Daniel risked a glance at her, and what he saw made his chest tighten. Hope wasn't cowering anymore. She wasn't just trying to protect her pups. She was ready to fight. The scars on her body, the fear she had lived with for so long, they had tried to break her. But all they had done was forge something stronger. Daniel saw it in her eyes. She wasn't prey anymore. She was a survivor. The front door finally gave way, shattering inward as two men rushed in. Daniel moved fast, firing one clean shot into the first intruder's shoulder, sending him spinning back onto the porch. The second lunged forward, too close for a gunshot. Daniel barely had time to react before a fist connected with his ribs, knocking the air from his lungs. He stumbled back, slamming into the table. The man grabbed his collar, shoving him hard against the wall. For a second, the world blurred. Then a deep, feral snarl ripped through the room. Hope. Before the man could react, she was on him. Her jaws clamped onto his arm, teeth sinking deep. A scream tore from his throat as he tried to shake her off, but she wouldn't let go. Daniel saw his opening. With a sharp twist, he wrenched himself free, grabbed the rifle, and drove the butt of the gun into the man's skull. He collapsed to the floor, unconscious. Hope released him, panting, blood staining her muzzle. For a moment she stood frozen, her whole body trembling. Daniel expected her to panic, to recoil, but she didn't. She had fought back. She had chosen to fight. And now, for the first time, she knew she wasn't helpless anymore. Outside, the last two men were retreating. They had underestimated their target, and now they were paying for it. Daniel stepped onto the porch, shotgun raised. "You want her?" he growled, his voice deadly calm. "Come take her." The leader, a tall, broad-shouldered man with cold, dead eyes, stared at him. Mason Ward. Daniel recognized the look in his face. A man who had never lost before. A man who couldn't believe he was losing now. "You don't know what you're doing, Cole," Mason spat. "She's mine." Daniel's finger tightened on the trigger. "She was never yours." Mason glared, but he knew he had lost. He took a step back, then another, before turning toward the woods. "This isn't over," he called over his shoulder. Daniel exhaled, lowering his gun. "Yeah, it is." Mason disappeared into the darkness, his men limping after him. And just like that, it was over. Inside the cabin, Hope lay beside her pups, licking them gently, her body still trembling from the fight. Daniel crouched beside her, running a careful hand over her head. "You did good," he murmured. "Real good." For the first time, she leaned into his touch. Daniel let out a slow breath, exhaustion settling into his bones. He had spent so long believing he was alone in this world that he had nothing left to fight for. But tonight had proved him wrong. Hope had found her way to him through a storm, through suffering, through hell itself. And now she wasn't just surviving. She was living, and so was he.
Thank you for watching this video. If you enjoyed it, please support me by clicking the logo in the bottom right corner to subscribe to my channel. This way you won't miss any of the exciting stories coming up. Thank you so much.